I'm here at the European Development Days in Brussels, and with me is Imoni Akpofure, the Director of the European Office for the IFC. Did I get that correctly?
You did indeed.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
So one of your roles, obviously, is to engage the private sector in a way that doesn't just make money for business, but also does something good.
Right.
What are you doing to get that done?
Well, the IFC basically focuses very much on trying to demonstrate that you can make money and actually have a development impact with the private sector. So we work across the whole spectrum of industries, a lot in the financial sector, but increasingly, for example, in the food and agribusiness sector, where we really feel we have a role to play in getting companies to be much more engaged with rural farmers, cooperatives. We provide finance and also capacity building. And it encourages the companies to do more in more difficult environments than they would ordinarily do.
How do you choose the companies that you want to work with? And is it mostly Western companies, or is it companies increasingly as well in the developing world?
It depends. If you take a large sector like infrastructure, where it tends to be very technical and you have to have global expertise, it tends to be OECD Western companies that are going into emerging markets. Financial sector, we're increasingly working with regional banks. So you might have a bank that's in South Africa that's going into the rest of Africa, or a Nigerian bank that's expanding into the rest of West Africa, etc. And we would support these banks. With the financial situation the way it is, we're finding that some regional banks, for example in Latin America, are actually wanting to expand beyond their borders, whereas the European banks are retreating. In the food and agribusiness sector, that's again mixed. Larger cocoa and larger sort of global commodity sectors tend to be OECD companies, but they would be working with local companies. So you might have a local retail chain, etc. I would say that we also have what we call a South-South initiative, which is very much trying to bring Indian companies to Africa, Arab companies to Africa, Eastern European companies to other parts of the world, etc. So it's, instead of always doing the North-South, how can we bring much more like-minded in terms of culture companies from one side of the globe to the next?
Do you have any sort of quotas or targets whereby maybe you want to increase certain sectors, or you want to increase the percentage of companies from the developing world that you're partnering with?
We don't set quotas for the companies from developing world. We do reward for South-South, as I said. Infrastructure in Africa is a big focus area for us. Our financial year ends in June. For the first time, we did over $1 billion worth of investments in infrastructure and natural resources in sub-Saharan Africa. We're very proud of that. First time we beat the $1 billion. Agribusiness, as I said, right through the whole supply chain, from the farm to the retail to the large suppliers. And then the financial sector. And in the financial sector, we want to do more with women. So we're particularly focused on supporting women-owned businesses, equity, debt, and then on climate-friendly and energy efficiency initiatives.
When you talk about business, of course, there is a financial crisis, and in general, companies, just as governments, are suffering right now, which makes it difficult to produce this win-win situation. And we are hearing a lot of criticism of companies that are essentially going to Africa, let's say European supermarket chains or a food producer going there and essentially grazing the countryside, and then when there's no rain anymore or the land is not as good as it was before, they're going elsewhere. So what do you find are some of those solutions that get you to that win-win situations in such challenging times right now?
We have what we call our environmental and social performance standards. And so these are both on the environment side to make sure that as much as possible you are protecting the environment as you develop as a company. And then on the social side to really, again, make sure that you are taking into account the local situation, affected people, making sure that they have a voice. So we tend to work with companies who want to work with us. Who are like-minded, who when we ask them to do difficult things, you can have a mining company, for example, that goes into a remote area. You can't hire everybody in the area. So how does the company actually manage to develop the small and medium enterprises so that they can become suppliers either to the larger company or potentially so that they can actually have an economic base. And so these are the kinds of companies that we're working with who really are inclusive in the way they're developing their local communities.
Isn't it usually the companies that don't have that model that need to change the most?
Yes and no. You have to, we have limited resources, so you do have to work with the ones who are most like you, who can then show the others. We are finding, for example, that if you go to the most difficult company that you know is not going to change, then with limited resources, why not put your effort to somebody else who shows the way? And we're finding there are a lot of very good companies, small, medium, and larger global companies who are very like-minded, who want to do the right thing. And it's beyond corporate social responsibility with foundations, it's very much this is part of my core business. I just came back from Tokyo, the World Bank IMF annual meetings, and we had a session with about 16 of our clients right across the world. They were from Africa, Latin America, Asia, and these were companies who have what we call an inclusive business model. So as well as looking for large clients, they're saying, we want to serve the rural poor by either having mobile phone access or having access to water. There's a water purification company that's actually producing purification plants in small enough sizes that they can go to villages and that the villagers can afford it. And they're making money doing this. It takes a much longer time, but they've decided that both from a responsibility point of view, but also from a long-term sustainability perspective, this is an area they'll go into.
IFC, of course, is focused squarely on promoting and helping and supporting the private sector. Other groups might not have that as their core focus, and yet they are also very much engaging the private sector, trying to help small and medium-sized businesses grow. What advice do you have from IFC's experience on how to best do that?
I would say that when people are working with the private sector, they really need to focus on the commercial viability. For a private sector company to be sustainable in the long run, it really needs to have a business model that's going to make money in the long run. If you need to have some support, either in donor funds for technical assistance, or sometimes, we had a health program where we just needed for a little while to help the banks manage the risk. The banks were scared to move into this sector. And so we had a risk sharing facility where we covered a little bit of the risk. It needs to be time bound. It should not be a crutch for the longer term. So it really goes back to focusing on the long-term commercial viability, using subsidized funds in a very targeted way and for a very defined period of time. And then we've realized also from our experience that combining technical assistance and capacity building with money actually leads to the best development outcomes.
That brings me to a topic I wanted to ask you about anyways, capacity building. IFC funds a little bit of that, but not that much. So tell me how you spend your capacity building dollars. Who gets these? How can organizations, including Devex member organizations, get engaged here?
We have become much more streamlined in our capacity building, and we have 4 key areas. The business enabling environment, the doing business report is probably the flagship of that, but it's much broader. We do things like public-private dialogues to allow in the country a way for the government and the private sector and civil society to be able to have a conversation around impediments to the private sector. Our Access to Finance program is the largest. It's our second program. And this again focuses on bringing IFC money through banks, leasing companies, microfinance institutions, and then bringing training to the microfinance companies and the small and medium enterprises, as well as to the banks that will be lending to them in understanding each other and being able to basically improve their standards. The third one is something we call our public-private partnerships, so it's advisory services to government and privatizations. And finally, on the sustainable business advice, it's really around climate-friendly technologies, helping companies with energy efficiency, helping companies look through their whole supplier chain, and again, helping the SMEs be good service providers. So Devex members who are interested in any of those areas, quite often when we have a project or a contract, we would advertise it on our website, or they can actually go and register on the World Bank Group contractors website so that we know what areas of expertise they have. We also go and do outreach events. So for example, I or a colleague would be happy to come if you're having a Devex event and actually talk to Devex members about the kinds of things that we're doing, what areas, what regions. Our advisory services very much focus on South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, the key areas, but we work globally.
Well, we might just take you up on that offer.
Your pleasure.
Thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome.
And thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned to Devex.